The Oklahoma Territory of 1889 witnessed countless schemes for land acquisition, but none proved more calculating than Thomas Whitman's plan to marry a Creek woman solely for access to tribal allotments. What this ambitious speculator never anticipated was that Mourning Dove, the educated daughter of a Creek merchant, had agreed to his proposal with her own intricate design for freedom already in motion. In the span of 3 years, she would transform from his legal property into his financial superior, using the very laws he thought protected him to orchestrate one of the most brilliant reversals of power the frontier had ever witnessed. Chapter 1. The Calculated Proposal. The dust of the Oklahoma land rush had barely settled when Thomas Whitman arrived in the newly formed territory with a scheme more cunning than any midnight claim staking. At 35, the Missouri land speculator had studied every legal loophole in the Dawes Severalty Act and discovered an opportunity that most settlers overlooked in their frenzied grab for homesteads. Native American women who married white men could have their tribal allotments converted to private property, and through the bonds of matrimony, their husbands gained control over these valuable lands that remained otherwise protected from white ownership. Thomas spent weeks studying the Creek Nation's enrollment records at the federal agency, identifying unmarried women whose families held substantial allotments along the fertile river valleys. His methodical approach treated marriage as a business transaction, calculating potential agricultural yields in proximity to planned railroad routes with the same precision he once used for evaluating Missouri farmland. The name Mourning Dove appeared repeatedly in property records, her deceased father's extensive holdings making her one of the wealthiest unmarried Creek women in the territory. The federal agency building in Muskogee became Thomas's second home as he researched the intricate details of tribal allotment law. The Dawes Act had divided tribal lands into individual parcels, with each Creek citizen receiving between 80 and 160 acres, depending on their age and family status. Mourning Dove's inheritance included not only her own allotment, but also her late father's substantial holdings along the Arkansas River, prime bottomland that would prove invaluable once the railroad companies began their inevitable expansion westward. Thomas orchestrated their first meeting with the precision of a military campaign, timing his visits to coincide with Mourning Dove's monthly appearance at the agency to collect her allotment payments. She stood barely 5 feet tall, her traditional Creek dress concealing what Thomas assumed was typical native simplicity, her downcast eyes suggesting the submissiveness he expected from indigenous women. Her limited English responses to his rehearsed pleasantries reinforced his assumption that she possessed neither the education nor the sophistication to understand the legal implications of marriage to a white man. What Thomas failed to recognize in his cultural arrogance was that Mourning Dove had spent 6 years at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, where she excelled in mathematics, English composition, and most importantly, studied American legal precedents with a passion that surprised even her instructors. Her apparent simplicity was a carefully cultivated performance, her broken English a strategic choice that allowed her to observe while appearing harmless. She understood exactly what Thomas wanted and had already begun calculating how his greed could serve her own plans for independence. The courtship proceeded according to Thomas's carefully planned timeline, each encounter designed to establish his dominance while maintaining the facade of respectability that territorial society demanded. He brought small gifts purchased from the general store, trinkets he believed would impress a simple native woman while costing him minimal investment. Mourning Dove accepted these offerings with carefully practiced gratitude, her performance so convincing that Thomas congratulated himself on finding such an easily manipulated target for his scheme. 3 weeks after their initial meeting, Thomas delivered his proposal with all the romantic passion of a business contract. He offered Mourning Dove protection from the uncertain future facing the Creek Nation, security through his American citizenship, and the promise of a comfortable life as the wife of a successful businessman. His words carefully avoided any mention of her land holdings, maintaining the pretense that his interests stemmed from genuine affection rather than calculated greed. Mourning Dove's acceptance came with tears that Thomas interpreted as grateful emotion, never suspecting they represented her relief that her own elaborate plan had begun successfully. She had waited 2 years for the right opportunist to arrive, someone whose arrogance would blind him to her true capabilities, whose greed would make him vulnerable to the legal strategy she had meticulously prepared during her years of education. Chapter 2. The Price of Paper Promises. The wedding ceremony that bound Thomas Whitman to Mourning Dove in April of 1889 existed as two separate events occupying the same moment in time, each participant understanding the ritual through entirely different lenses of meaning and intention. The civil ceremony at the territorial courthouse satisfied legal requirements that would transfer Mourning Dove's property rights to her new husband, while the Creek blessing performed by her uncle afterward honored traditions that Thomas dismissed as quaint superstition. He never suspected that the Creek ceremony contained provisions for women's property protection that predated American law by centuries, ancient safeguards that Mourning Dove would eventually invoke in ways that would shatter his carefully constructed plans. Thomas wasted no time implementing his development schemes across Mourning Dove's inherited lands, surveying the most fertile sections for immediate agricultural exploitation while identifying parcels suitable for speculation when the railroad expansion reached their region. His days were filled with meetings alongside territorial businessmen who congratulated him on his clever acquisition of protected Creek lands through the simple expedient of marriage. These men spoke freely in Mourning Dove's presence, assuming her limited English prevented her from understanding their complex discussions of commodity prices, railroad bonds, and property speculation. Mourning Dove maintained her performance of submissive ignorance with masterful precision, serving coffee to Thomas's business partners while memorizing every detail of their conversations. Her apparently clumsy English concealed fluent comprehension of legal terminology acquired during her years at Carlisle, where progressive teachers had encouraged Native students to understand American law as a tool for protecting their interests. Each evening, after Thomas retired to his study to review contracts, she meticulously documented every transaction in a journal hidden beneath loose floorboards in her sewing room. The territorial legal system that Thomas believed protected his absolute control over his wife's property contained complexities he never bothered to examine, confident that the simple fact of marriage guaranteed his ownership of everything Mourning Dove possessed. His arrogance blinded him to her frequent visits to the federal courthouse, where she cultivated relationships with clerks and junior attorneys under the guise of bringing lunch to her husband during his business meetings. These legal professionals, charmed by her apparent eagerness to understand her new American life, gladly explained various aspects of territorial law to someone they perceived as harmlessly curious. Mourning Dove's questions appeared innocently random, but followed a careful pattern designed to build a comprehensive understanding of property law, contract obligations, and most importantly, the grounds for legal dissolution of marriage under territorial statutes. She learned that Oklahoma Territory's rapid development had created unique legal precedents that differed from established state laws, particularly regarding women's property rights in cases where husbands committed financial misconduct. The young lawyers who explained these intricacies never imagined they were providing ammunition for one of the territory's most brilliant legal strategies. 6 months into their marriage, Mourning Dove began establishing her own network of connections throughout the Creek Nation and beyond, using her household allowance to make small investments that Thomas dismissed as harmless feminine pursuits. Her purchase of sewing supplies from Creek merchants seemed unremarkable, but these transactions created paper trails documenting her independent economic activity. Her correspondence with distant relatives appeared to maintain family connections, but actually established communication with educated Native women facing similar circumstances throughout the territory. Thomas's complacency grew with each successful harvest from Mourning Dove's lands, his initial vigilance relaxing as months passed without any sign of resistance from his supposedly simple wife. He began spending more time in Oklahoma City, pursuing larger speculative ventures while leaving Mourning Dove to manage their household alone. These absences provided invaluable opportunities for her to deepen her legal research, expand her secret financial network, and prepare the documentation that would eventually prove his systematic exploitation of her inherited wealth. The seeds of Mourning Dove's independence sprouted invisibly beneath the surface of her seemingly compliant marriage, nourished by Thomas's arrogance and watered with his assumption that native intelligence could never match white cunning. Chapter 3. Seeds of Independence. By the autumn of 1890, Mourning Dove had transformed her position as Thomas Whitman's supposedly powerless wife into the foundation for an economic empire he couldn't see growing beneath his very nose. Her secret partnerships with Creek merchants began innocuously enough, purchasing household goods from tribal suppliers rather than territorial stores, a practice Thomas actually encouraged since it reduced household expenses he considered beneath his attention. What he never suspected was that each transaction included hidden agreements, with Mourning Dove investing her carefully hoarded household allowance into their expanding businesses as a silent partner whose returns accumulated in ledgers Thomas would never examine. The Creek merchant Joseph Harjo became her primary confederate, his trading post serving as the hub for increasingly sophisticated financial arrangements that extended far beyond the territorial boundaries Thomas imagined contained his wife's world. Through Joseph's connections, Mourning Dove established banking relationships in Kansas City under her maiden name, accounts that remained legally separate from her husband's property according to Missouri state law that recognized certain rights for married women that the Oklahoma Territory had not yet addressed. These accounts grew steadily through profits from her merchant partnerships, cattle investments arranged through Creek ranchers, and most lucratively, her stakes in cotton shipments that moved through tribal territories toward Eastern markets. Mourning Dove's household allowance, which Thomas provided with patronizing regularity while commenting on her simple needs, became seed capital for ventures he couldn't imagine a native woman understanding. She invested in a Creek women's cooperative that produced traditional textiles for Eastern collectors, her initial $50 contribution growing to hundreds within months as demand for authentic native crafts exploded among wealthy collectors in Philadelphia and New York. Her alleged trips to visit sick relatives actually involved inspecting her investments, reviewing ledgers, and planning expansions that would soon rival Thomas's own agricultural profits. The network of native women in similar circumstances that Mourning Dove cultivated became more than a support system. It evolved into an underground railroad of financial independence that shared information, legal strategies, and economic opportunities across tribal boundaries. Mary Little Crow, married to a German settler who treated her as unpaid labor, began hiding profits from her secret preservation business in Mourning Dove's Kansas City accounts. Sarah Redbird, whose husband gambled away her allotment income, learned to create false household expense reports that redirected funds toward legitimate investments managed through Creek merchants. These women met monthly under the guise of church gatherings, their prayer meetings actually strategic sessions where they shared legal discoveries and refined their plans for eventual freedom. Mourning Dove's correspondence with women's rights advocates in the eastern states appeared to Thomas as harmless letter writing that occupied his wife during his increasing absences. He never suspected that these communications connected her with Susan B. Anthony's legal advisors, progressive lawyers who provided detailed guidance on exploiting territorial laws, unique provisions for women's property rights. These Eastern advocates, fascinated by the intersection of native rights and women's suffrage, supplied Mourning Dove with legal precedents from New York and Massachusetts courts that had ruled in favor of wives seeking independence from exploitative husbands. The documentation Mourning Dove accumulated filled 3 hidden strongboxes buried beneath her root cellar, each paper meticulously organized to build an irrefutable case for financial misconduct that would trigger territorial provisions for property reversion. She possessed receipts proving Thomas had sold crops from her inherited lands without proper documentation, contracts showing he had mortgaged her property for his speculative ventures without her informed consent, and, most damaging, correspondence between Thomas and other speculators discussing how to maximize profits from native women's lands through strategic marriages. Thomas's blindness to Mourning Dove's growing economic power stemmed from a racist assumption so fundamental to his worldview that he couldn't conceive of its falsehood. Even as her secret assets exceeded his legitimate holdings, He continued treating her with the condescending paternalism that characterized his every interaction. His business partners occasionally commented on Mourning Dove's apparent intelligence, observations Thomas dismissed with laughter and assurances that she merely parroted phrases without comprehension. This arrogance would prove his ultimate downfall. As 1891 dawned, Mourning Dove calculated that her accumulated wealth and legal documentation had reached critical mass. Her network included 12 women prepared to testify about systematic exploitation. Her Kansas City accounts held sufficient funds to sustain extended legal battles. And most importantly, territorial courts had recently ruled in favor of several women seeking property independence. The timing for her revelation approached, requiring only the perfect moment when Thomas's vulnerability would prevent effective counteraction against the strategy she had spent 3 years perfecting. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The morning of March 15th, 1892, began like any other in the Whitman household until Thomas found Mourning Dove seated at his desk in his private study, surrounded by legal documents he had never seen before. Her transformation was immediate and complete. The submissive wife replaced by a woman whose bearing commanded attention. Her perfect English delivered with the crisp precision of a trained attorney. The divorce papers she placed before him bore the seal of the territorial court, but more devastating were the accompanying documents charging him with systematic financial fraud against a Creek Nation citizen. Thomas's hands trembled as he read through Mourning Dove's meticulously prepared case, each page revealing a depth of legal sophistication that shattered every assumption upon which he had built his exploitative scheme. She had documented every unauthorized sale of crops from her lands, every mortgage taken without her genuine consent, every profit diverted from her rightful inheritance into his speculative ventures. The evidence included notarized statements from witnesses who had observed him discussing his marriage as a business arrangement, correspondence with other speculators celebrating their acquisition of native lands through strategic marriages, and, most damaging, his own signature on documents that clearly violated territorial statutes regarding spousal property rights. The territorial courthouse in Muskogee filled to capacity when Mourning Dove presented her case before Judge William Crawford, a progressive jurist whose appointment reflected the federal government's growing concern about the exploitation of Native citizens. Her testimony, delivered in eloquent English that stunned those who had known her only as Thomas's silent wife, outlined 3 years of systematic documentation undertaken while maintaining the pretense of ignorance. She presented bank records from Kansas City showing her independent business ventures, profits that legally belonged to her under Missouri law that Thomas had never bothered to understand. The parade of witnesses Mourning Dove had assembled told stories that transformed the judge's expression from skepticism to outrage. 12 Native women testified about similar exploitation by white husbands who had married them solely for land access, creating a pattern of abuse that demanded legal intervention. Creek merchants presented ledgers showing Mourning Dove's business acumen, investments that had flourished despite Thomas's attempts to limit her economic activity. Most powerfully, 3 territorial attorneys testified that Mourning Dove had consulted them about property law with a sophistication that exceeded many practicing lawyers, proving her complete understanding of the legal implications of every document Thomas had forced her to sign. Thomas's attorney attempted to argue that territorial law gave husbands absolute control over their wives' property, but Judge Crawford's ruling demolished this defense with citations from recent federal decisions that protected Native property rights even within marriage. The judge noted that Thomas had committed fraud by representing himself as offering a genuine marriage while secretly planning economic exploitation, a deception that invalidated any claims to Mourning Dove's property. Furthermore, the evidence of financial misconduct triggered territorial provisions that not only returned Mourning Dove's inherited lands, but also awarded her significant portions of the improvements Thomas had made using profits from her property. The ruling transformed Mourning Dove from a supposedly powerless Native wife into one of the wealthiest independent women in Oklahoma Territory. The lands Thomas had developed with profits from her inheritance now belonged entirely to her. Their increased value representing just compensation for 3 years of exploitation. Her Kansas City accounts, revealed during the proceedings, contained enough capital to establish her own agricultural enterprise that would soon exceed anything Thomas had imagined. The network of Native women she had organized used her precedent to file their own cases, creating a wave of property reversions that territorial speculators had never anticipated. Mourning Dove emerged from the courthouse as a symbol of Native resistance through legal brilliance rather than violence. Her victory proving that mastering American law provided more lasting freedom than any physical rebellion could achieve. Within months, she had established the Mourning Dove Trading Company, an enterprise that provided economic opportunities for Native women throughout the territory, while building her fortune to heights that made her former husband's schemes seem pathetically small in comparison. Mourning Dove's victory proved that the sharpest weapon on the frontier wasn't a gun, it was the mind. For 3 years, she played the role they expected of her, studying every weakness, every law, every word, until the day she turned her silence into power. Her patience became her rebellion, her knowledge her freedom, and in a world that saw her as property, she rewrote the rules and walked away as one of the richest, most respected women in the territory. If this story of cunning and justice inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold frontier tales. Could you have kept such a perfect deception for 3 long years? Share your thoughts below.